name is Tosca Bruno van Vijvijk, and I co-direct the Transnational NGO initiative here at the Moynihan Institute in Maxwell. We have an extensive practitioner engagement program in which we invite NGO practitioners, NGO leaders to, amongst others, visit the Maxwell School in order to interact with us and to interact with students. What is so important for us about that is that in our initiative we find it really important to integrate, to create virtual feedback loops between what practitioners tell us about their challenges and their solutions in their NGOs, to integrate that back into our research agenda and into our teaching. And as part of our practitioner engagement, every year we invite a visiting Moynihan TNGO fellow to come and visit us and to work with us on a research topic, a challenge that reflects a challenge in the organization where the leader is working. The fellow formulates the research topic as long as it fits within the broader mission of the TNGO initiative, which is to focus on the governance, leadership, and effectiveness of transnational NGOs. We're fine with it. And this year we have Nyaradzayi Gumbonzvanda, and she is with us as the Secretary General, or General Secretary, I should say, of the World Young Women's Christian Association, YWCA, which you probably know if you have lived in the US or are American. There are YMCAs and YWCAs all over. In fact, you visited two by now. But Nyaradzayi is in Geneva. She heads the whole world network of YWCAs that is focused on leadership development, particularly in young women, in order for that to contribute to human rights fulfillment, to social justice goals. And so what is interesting about Nyaradzayi's organization is that it works, as you said so nicely, on the nexus of gender issues, on the nexus of youth issues, and not one more, and I've forgotten it now.
Faith.
Faith. Of course, I wanted to start by saying what's so interesting is that you're a faith-based organization, as well as a network structure. Nyaradzayi has a very interesting background. She is a Zimbabwean who was trained in Zimbabwe as a human rights lawyer. She has extensive experience in women and children's human rights issues, but also has a long background in researching as well as working in conflict resolution and mediation. Within the women's movement, her focus has been on violence against women, peace with justice, property rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and HIV and AIDS. She works for over 10 years in UNIFEM as well as UNICEF in various countries as well as regions in Africa, Liberia, Zimbabwe, and region as in UNIFEM Eastern Africa. In 2007, she joined the YWCA. And her topic for today's talk is the same as her topic, the research challenge that she brought for the whole 2 weeks to the Institute, and that is intergenerational, shared, and transformative leadership as one way of advancing women's rights. And she's going to explain all what that is and where you want to bring it in YWCA. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm looking at technology being on my back.
Yeah.
And having the microphone here and this gadget here and that camera. And so I need to figure out the best way that I can be in physical contact with all of you and at the same time meet all the other expectations that we have. It's great. It's great to be here. And for me to be in this conversation with you on intergenerational leadership, which is very dear to my heart for many reasons. It works, so I just need to do it this way. This afternoon, I understand that I have about 35 to 40 minutes to share with you, and then we go into a conversation. I'm looking at this being a mutual conversation for raising questions, giving your reflections, bouncing ideas, and us growing this concept together. So in my outline, my presentation outline, I'm going to bring you a little bit into the YWCA, the World YWCA, as a basis of my research. Because as a fellow, the role and the expectation is that as a leader, these 2 weeks is supposed to help me grow my effectiveness as a leader, is expecting me to advance one issue that I deeply care for in my organization. And so my discussion with you this afternoon is going to be so much based on the experience of the World YWCA, but also drawing on my own personal life experiences here and there. So that's the background about the YWCA. The second aspect which I'll explore with you this afternoon is why. Why do we need to focus on intergenerational leadership? To just ground that conversation on the why. Why is it so important for us to focus on intergenerational leadership? The third is to show the link between intergenerational leadership perspectives with the notions of shared and transformative leadership. Before I came here, my idea was to address these 3 dimensions together simultaneously. That's the beauty of being in a university. You shift your entry points and perspectives. And one of it, which has been a shift, is now for me to look at intergenerational leadership as the main domain, and then locate the conversation on shared and transformative leadership as subdomains of the intergenerational, just for me to provide that clarification. The third is to say, how does intergenerational leadership contribute to advancing women's human rights and gender equality? Because women's human rights and gender equality is a deep value and commitment of my organization, but it is also something that I work for the rest of my life. And so I have that passion to work on women and children's rights, and so I'm going to show that linkage. I'll spend a little bit of time exploring with you what have been some of my observations, both in practice, but also in the literature. And I'm just so grateful to all the students and colleagues in Tosca who really helped me to have a good range of materials to dig and have a feel of some of the conversations. And I'll conclude with an open slide on recommendations. So this is just how we're going to cover the next couple of minutes together. This great organization for which I'm the General Secretary or the Chief Executive, we always say, am I the General, or I am the Secretary, or I am the Chief Executive. These are all important terms in leadership. But most importantly, I know that I am a team leader in an amazing, amazing organization that was founded in 1855 in a particular context in which there was the Industrial Revolution and the Crimean War, and young women were coming into the streets of London, and therefore 2 women decided to form this organization in order to provide shelter, but a space in which young women's leadership can grow for them to provide opportunities for their own life. So we are very much grounded on a context of service and a context of leadership development. And in 1894, 5 of our YWCAs came together to then form the Federation, which is the World YWCA. This is important because we are talking about local initiative, a national initiative in Great Britain, becoming an international and global initiative, which is the World YWCA. And for me, that is also about leadership, a leadership that is transformative, which starts from a particular experience and practice to becoming transforming of a norm in the world, and not just in transforming a situation in a community. That's for me very fascinating in terms of how do leaders over generations impact a bigger agenda. Presently, we are in 125 countries with 808 affiliates and 17 which are in which we call developing associations. I lead this movement of 25 million women and girls of all age groups. This is also something that informed my need to focus on intergenerational leadership, because my organization is not just one age group. It's not just the old mamas. It's women of all generations who are impacted by the same issue differently according to their context, their age, their income, their other social status. So there is a range of diversities which shape and inform how life is experienced by women across the world, but also on how women experience their leadership. Our core mission is essentially leadership development for women and girls, for us to be able to take collective action so that we can live in a world of peace, a world of justice, a world of freedom, a world where we can have good health and also care for the environment. Currently, we have 3 programs. We're focusing on really investing on intergenerational leadership significantly. That's why I chose this as a topic. And also on women's human rights. And on women's human rights, we really are saying we need women and girls to be able to claim their rights. And not just to enjoy or their rights to be protected, but for them to be able to claim their human rights. And ability to claim your rights means you need to have some sense of self-awareness and self or collective leadership for you to be able to claim your rights. And for us, we are therefore focusing on the 3 issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights and HIV and violence against women as the key domains in which we are supporting women to claim their rights and to have their rights protected, and also focusing on movement building and good governance. We have a 2-tier system of our governance, which is the World Council, where we come together, the 108 association. We were meeting last year as 1,000 of us in Zurich, and we also have a board of 20 women. And on this board, there is a commitment to 25% women, young women in leadership. I'll come back to that in terms of intergenerational leadership. I'd like to just mention to you the 3 conceptual frameworks which is grounding my research. The first conceptual framework grounding my research and my reflection is the human rights-based approach. A human rights-based approach which acknowledges that women and girls are individuals with rights. They are rights holders who have a right to participate, who have a voice, and therefore within that rights-based approach, they have the possibility and must be able to influence policies that affect their own lives and not just be consumers of application of policy. So a rights-based approach creates a qualitative relationship with notions of leadership in terms of persons with rights and responsibility being able to have a voice. So the question in leadership is whether all women have a voice to shaping policy and decisions that affect their lives. That for me is the aspect around a rights-based approach shaping my research. The second is the empowerment approach. The empowerment approach is a very important approach in our work on women's human rights because it continues to emphasize that communities which needs to be empowered, or the aspects of empowerment, must include a range of investing in knowledge, in skills, in resources, in opportunities, and in choices that enable the individual to claim their rights. So for you to be empowered, you need the knowledge, the skills, the resources, the opportunities, and the choice. When you have that package in various ways, it means you have some measure of possibility to significantly claim your rights, which also means from an empowerment and intergenerational approach, do young women have the same knowledge, resources, skills, choices for them to experience and exercise their leadership compared to older women? Do a young man, 21 years old, have the same opportunities, choices, capacities, and possibilities to claim his space in a multi-gender space? So that's the notion of empowerment. And a notion which I would like to explore much further and which I'm grateful to have been here at Syracuse is the social capital framework. And this social capital framework of relating to human resource management is a very interesting dimension for me in terms of how do we harness and build on the potential that exists, the full potential that exists within our communities, that potential of men and women, boys and girls, to be able to contribute to development and to the well-being, not just of families, but of communities and of the nation. So the notion of social capital for me is very interesting in terms of the current understanding that we are not fully harnessing the potential that exists of the leadership of young men, young women, the potential of older men and older women in order to contribute significantly to development. Our current approaches in leadership are very limiting and therefore are excluding the potential. We know that we are in a world where there is a 7 billion population, and of this 7 billion, mostly are young people and women, and therefore there is a natural indication. I'd like to move a little bit more now into why an intergenerational approach. And these 4 main comments are not exhaustive, they're just indicative, as this was a very short time, and it's also more of just picking some of the key points. The first on why an intergenerational approach is that the current experience, my experience in NGOs, significantly also including my own NGO, is that we are so much modeled on the leadership culture of hierarchy, power, and position. And these models of leadership, which are so hierarchical, so it's always about climbing the ladder and not going across, it's always a vertical climb. Success is always measured by upward growth and not necessarily by fulfillment. An approach that so much celebrates positions and not celebrate influence. The current models of leadership and structures are so much about, oh, here is the president, here is the CEO. It's not necessarily affirming of all the other layers of leadership and contribution that exist in the organization. And because of these current models of leadership that we have in NGOs, in governments, and elsewhere, it means there is an insufficient recognition and affirmation of young people as leaders. Because you rarely have many young people at the apex of the institutions. It therefore gives an invisibility to the contribution of young people as leaders. And that for me is the inadequacy of our current leadership models in terms of affirming the contribution that exists at each generation. And also this current model of leadership that we have does not in some way also sufficiently embrace those who have retired. Because those who have retired are expected to actually retire, go home and care for the grandchildren. Even if they decided in their early life never to have grandchildren, but they're expected to go home and care for somebody. They are not expected to still be visible, available, because of the tension that I'll also talk about later. And that takes me to the second point, that an intergenerational approach enables us to have the ability to harness the potential of young people. Currently, the potential of young people is not harnessed, and yet young people in my country, the legal age of majority is 18 years. When you are 18 years, you can marry, you can have custody of your children, you can have guardianship, you can make all critical decisions in your family. When you turn 18, you can vote. You can vote in a president and vote him out. I mean, young people are the majority with a lot of voice in a number of countries. So you can actually vote in these guys or vote them out. So there is that power. Young people are in the labor market. A huge involvement in the employment and labor market, whether semi-skilled or recent entry, whatever. So there is this recognition in one sector of young people's contribution to the social, economic, and political well-being of a nation, and yet there is no recognition of the young people being in leadership. It then says they don't have experience. So that disconnect for me is something that is interesting. The second is that we have seen the innovation, the energy, including in my organization, the innovation, the energy, the creativity that resides in different generations. And how do we turn that innovation, that creativity, and that experience to inform and contribute to leadership? And here I've given 2 examples of the social media and the 2 examples of the Arab Spring. There's a critique that there's been an Arab Spring, but possibly it will turn into an Arab autumn or winter for the young people. So young people create a revolution, but then they are not in the center of decisions post the revolution. So that aspect of power relationship, which is part of my earlier discussion on the models of leadership. The third is that within the inability to harness experience, is that across the age generations, we experience the same issue differently. I lead an organization that talks about domestic violence. When you are talking about domestic violence in a mixed age group, for women my age, it's always about my relationship with my spouse. For adolescents and young women, they talk about the impact of domestic violence on their own education. So it's the same issue, but the emphasis is different depending with the age. Domestic violence, even when we talk about violence against women, the violence which I don't experience is cyber stalking, cyber violence, cyber abuse, cyber harassment. And yet many young women are experiencing that kind of violence. So if you don't have young people in your leadership to define policies and programs, you will naturally exclude prioritizing the kind of issues that this generation is facing. The same for older women, 70, 80-year-olds who are come back to stay with their children or are in homes. They experience a totally different culture of domestic violence. It's no longer spousal relationship. It's maybe discrimination. It's maybe nobody talking to you. So for me, intergenerational leadership approaches enables us to bring the perspective of issues across generations to inform a quality and comprehensive program that responds to the needs of all communities. The other aspect on why an intergenerational approach is the influence of culture and values. This is very interesting because I experience it every day, that leadership is always experienced in a context of culture. And we know that when you are in a certain region, including my own region in Africa, when you go to a meeting, even in a board meeting, the expectation is usually for the slightly older women to speak first. If it is in a mixed group with men, they first look at which man is going to speak first. The younger ones are expected to speak later, but the door has to be opened by, it's like young people need a permission to speak, even if they are leaders themselves, even if they're sitting in the same space of leadership. So the question is, how do we embrace the positive aspects of culture, of listening to each other, but at the same time expand the space to be able to innovate where there is a transformation of culture and an affirmation of the positive aspects of culture. And in my organization, we're always talking about creating safe space. As I said, I come from a faith-based, faith-inspired organization, and we always refer to the story, for those who are Christians in this room, of how Mary, a young woman of 16 years old who was pregnant, visited Elizabeth, a very old woman who was also pregnant, and imagined what they talked about, because Mary was pregnant with Jesus and Elizabeth was pregnant with John the Baptist, but there were 2 generations of pregnant women. And we always use that example to say we need leaders of all generations to talk about issues that affect them, because the young woman was facing a kind of discrimination of being young and pregnant, and the older woman was facing the same discrimination, but of being old and pregnant. And yet they were both pregnant, but the kind of pressure they faced were different. So for us, the issue of culture and context and values is so important around violence. The last, which is on why an intergenerational approach is to expand the notion of democracy. I think the expansion of the notion of democracy and apply the good governance in our own organizations is very, very important. In my country, I can use my country as an example. Our president has been in leadership for the last 32 years. He is 88 years old. And us in civil society, hey, we need a change of leadership, we need shared leadership, we need young leaders. So if we're saying that to the public sector, we need to model that within our own organizations. We need to speak from a position of strength. So also we need our own organizations to be part of modeling. And I believe that expanding the notion of democracy and giving citizens voice is because young people are citizens who already have roles and responsibility and therefore need to have a voice in leadership, and that is not sufficiently available. The link between intergenerational leadership and transformative leadership, I've talked about expanding the knowledge and experience base of an organization. So as an organization, if we have intergenerational leadership, we are able to expand the knowledge base on the basis of which we deliver our programs and services to communities. We are able to create the glue. For me, creating the glue of community cohesion, community trust, community respect, and community confidence using all other diversities is so important, because when we have intergenerational leadership, we are creating an opportunity, whether the NGO is the community or widely, to have space for conversation on difficult issues at the same time. And we know that in many instances there is no opportunity for good conversation happening simultaneously in the same space, and this is part of a transformative agenda in itself. It will contribute to quality policy options and the quality of services that we provide as organizations, because there will be a greater intergenerational perspective. So the shared leadership contributes to a transformation in itself. Not just a transformation in terms of programs, but a transformation in the perspective. The social-based capital that I have talked about, that it builds a strong mentorship base. For me, this is equally important, that we have a strong core mentorship base for organizations in social justice, because we know that the issues that we are dealing with will not end today. These are issues which are there over time, and therefore we need to mentor leaders over time in order to sustain the response that we need. And also the modeling of good governance within our own organizations. The contribution to women's rights. How does intergenerational leadership contribute to women's rights? It supports, if we take intergenerational leadership significantly, it helps us to create a critical mass of young advocates and champions for women's rights who are already leaders. So if you invest in critical leadership development for young women, you know they are going to be on their feet, whether in the organization or in their lives, for the next 40, 50 years. So you're actually creating a great base and a critical mass. And also we are able to confront the barriers that affect women across issues, because you're able to have a more in-depth analysis, and the issues I've talked about there around quality, participation, retention, and succession. The resources that exist and the times that are invisible. The intergenerational nature of gender equality. When I talk about the intergenerational nature of gender inequality, we know from the studies in education that if a girl is denied education now, the impact is not just lack of employment. The impact 20 years, 40 years later could be having no options but to remain in an abusive relationship, because she doesn't have the economic power or the social power to say no. So just a lack of access to one right early in life is another impact later on in life on other domains and dimensions. So this is where I'm referring to the intergenerational nature of gender equality, that it is multidimensional, but also one lack of investment in one right has implications and outcomes in other issues. The long-term solution, I've referred to that, and the current deficits in our projects. The last point, just to emphasize that what is a little bit analysis coming out is we have multiple projects for women's rights and for advancing empowerment. But do we still have a women's movement? There's a lot of literature around that on whether there's a women's rights movement or we only have programs and projects. So if we take and invest in an intergenerational approach, it means we are creating that glue which moves from beyond the project and the programs to sustaining a women's movement, because it's not just about the projects and programs, it's about the long-term vision. And this is an aspect that I would like to explore further. Just some analysis and observations, which is my last piece, before making the recommendations, is that for the last 10 days I've been here, and both from the students who helped me with this research and also my own observation, we still have very little literature on intergenerational leadership, very few research on intergenerational leadership, but much more on shared and transformational leadership. So this is an area that is growing, and that I hope we can continue to explore possibilities both within academia, but also to feed into the NGO governance and leadership perspective. The second observation is that in many programs of NGOs, young people, and especially young women, are seen as beneficiaries and program participants and not as leaders. So there is significant work that is happening in many NGOs around youth, around young people, but it's more from a vulnerability, beneficiary, participation perspective, and not sufficiently from a leadership perspective. Therefore, we see that the approaches that exist from the literature and the experience is that for the few programs that are there around intergenerational leadership, they are looked at from a structural point of view, from an institutional reform point of view, the brick and mortar of an organization, like my organization, will say, we need affirmative action. 25% on your board should be young women. That is a structural response. That is a governance command response. It is not organic to the organization evolving naturally the leadership of young people. It's fulfilling a constitutional requirement. So you would find in such a model that organizations would have young people on the board and fulfill the 25%. But those young people who are on the board are not supported to be effective on the board. They are there, but there is no accompaniment sufficiently for them to be effective on the board. So it could be ceremonial presence, an issue that we have discussed on affirmative action for gender, to say if you need to put special measures for women, make sure there is adequate accompaniment to support the women who are put on affirmative action. The second is that the current programs that exist on leadership focus on leadership for young people, for decision making in their personal lives and not in public policy. So we have good programs around youth leadership, around mentorship, around life skills. They are great programs, but their main focus is on making decisions in the personal and the private, and not sufficiently on growing the young people to be leaders in the public sector. There are a few exceptions that I've seen with the Girl Guides and others. The project participants I've talked about, which is more about just delivering a project and an activity, but not being in the governance of the organization. From the analysis, it's also emerging that older people, and mostly women, are expected to retire from active leadership, and yet are still expected to contribute to the sustainability of the organizations. So what happens is, as you grow older, organizations expect you to continue to contribute, but not necessarily contribute your leadership skills, the influence and the networks that you have, but to contribute through your past, through your legacy when you are gone. And it creates a tension at times in terms of that generation. And there are the generational tensions and perceptions that have come out of my analysis. Older people are seen as never going away. They stay on to power, they hold on to these positions, and they are not letting go. You know, that old mama has been there for how many, you know? She's still there. She has arrived, and she arrives on time. she's so committed. But the older people feel, can they just move on, you know? And so it's a perception, it's a tension that exists across generation. And the older people also have a sense of entitlement. I earned this position. It did not just come. I did strive for it. I have a right to be where I am. And these young people want to be given an opportunity. Why should they be given? They should earn it. They should struggle for it. They should claim it. That's a tension that exists. And there is also a tension that young people, yeah, they could be great leaders, but look, they're inexperienced. They're unavailable. She has to go to work, pick her children. And after all, she told me that she's moving from Amman next month. She's going to get a job in Hong Kong. So why should she be on the board? Because after all, she's not going to be here. Or she's going to get married and go away, or her job will take her away. So the issue of mobility, availability. So this is the tension which exists on intergenerational leadership. And last 2 points, that there is not enough qualitative space for intergenerational dialogue on leadership issues. There is not enough of coming together across generations to discuss issues of power, to discuss issues of sharing space. We come together to discuss other issues. There is no water in the village. The young ones are not going to school. We are worried about our domestic violence center. So generations come together to discuss practical interventions, but not enough to say, hey, let's talk about leadership. It's very sensitive. There is no quality space for such conversations. And I've already talked about our current leadership organizations, which are mostly institutional, structural, and culture. And the culture of our organizations also at times do not promote intergenerational leadership. Meetings are held at a time when young people are not available, or at a time when older people are not able to be there. So just looking at the time, when do we hold meetings, for what durations, at what cost? I had a big meeting in Zurich recently. Visa. Most young women who have scholarship could not get the visa because they were categorized to be in the risky group, because they are not employed, because they could not show on the visa form that they have an income, they have a family to go back to, and therefore can be at risk. And I had about 8-10 young women who were unable to come to the governance meeting because the rules categorize them as risky. This is about culture and perception, which I'm talking about. And so it's not just the culture of the organization, it's also the public context within which we operate. I have seen traveling around how much young people have to be scrutinized a little bit more. Yesterday in our career talk, we talked about the border posts, and we see young people having to be scrutinized a little bit more. It's all part of the culture of perception about what is a young person today, and that I think is also limits. I have some recommendations, but I wanted to stop here for now, and for us to have a conversation, and then I'll conclude with a few recommendations. So questions, comments, and reflections. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, who'd like to start?
Yes, please.
What are the strategies in terms of advocacy to change this perception or this situation where the youth are seen as a risk more than potential leaders? So if you think about when people are developing projects in international organizations or in government, they see youth as a risk. In Latin America, there's an case very clear with all the gangs in Central America, all the resources from USA see the intervention for youth as a risk, not as a potential creative population. So I'm thinking how organizations that have interest in youth development could lead somehow an advocacy initiative to change this structure from the decision makers perspective. So how in international organizations we can promote this and change
There are a couple of strategies that I would recommend. The first is to continue to apply the notion of nothing about us without us. So instead of us, the adults, talking about youth issues, young people's issues, we need to have our role as leveraging space for young people to lead in the conversation around their issues. So that for me is very important. It's part of my own leadership style, that if I have 10 minutes to speak in any meeting, which I am with a YWCA or any other young people person who is not necessarily YWCA, I share the space. I may speak for 8 minutes, but still want to have this young person to speak for themselves on the issue. Because creating space to give visibility of young people as leaders makes a difference. I have been in meetings where I had at the UN, there were 2 speakers. One was Mark Zuckerberg. He was not seen in the negative image of young people. He is a young person, 26, an innovator. He was given the same acclaim, the same recognition, the same which any other innovator would have. In the same panel was a young man who had been a child soldier. The young man who had been a child soldier, a child combatant, was not asked to talk about his skills and experience, what he thinks were the skills and experience that he now has out of this very painful life that he lived in the bush for 4 or 5 years. But he was asked to re-narrate the bad things that happened to his life. So, if this young man who was the child soldier, child combatant, was asked to translate his painful experience and say, I am here, I feel I'm a confident young man, I can advise you on the demobilization policy of our country. I can advise you on how other young people can avoid being militarily recruited without their will. I can advise. If he was asked to turn his negative experience to a leadership experience, his narrative would have been different. But when he left the podium, it was like, you're still looking at a child soldier. You are not looking at the leader. And that is my point. That whether positive experiences or negative experiences, we need to, one strategy is to build, create the space, the opportunity, the potential, the empowerment model for young people to do a reprojection. The second is we need to, the narrative of NGOs, including my work, is not just, we live in an economic model of scarcity. So every sentence starts with the negative story instead of the positive story. So our organizations, the YWCA, Save the Children, ActionAid, Civicus, we need to document the powerful narratives of young people as leaders, and not just the sad stories of what is happening to young people. We need to balance the narrative. The third that we need is co-mentorship on leadership. I think even in our boards, we can do board mentorship. It's a model that I would like to recommend to my YWCA as an experience of spending this moment, 2 weeks here, is if each board of an organization, an NGO, could co-opt 2 or 3 young people to be on the board, not as full board members, but as associate board members who can contribute in the discussion, who can be in the debates, even if they don't have the right to vote. It means at the end of 4 years of the term of that board, that young person has the skills, the knowledge of running an organization, and can be available to any other organization to be on the board, and not just for that organization. That's a programmatic investment to leadership, and which I think as a strategy is doable. The last is to continue to mention the contradiction. And in this country, we saw after the Obama election a very strong acclaim that he was voted by the young people. So if young people voted a leader, it means the young people are capable of leading because they were making a choice. So how do we continue to capture the dichotomy of young people being seen to be responsible, accountable, and having all these tough decisions, but at the same time we're saying they don't have leadership? The last is to debunk the myth that every leader is a capable leader. Every adult leader is a capable leader. Every adult leader is a knowledgeable leader. I had to grow my leadership. Every person who comes into leadership has to grow their skills just as much as the young people have to grow their skills. We have so many people in my organization who come on the board when they are 40, they are 30, they are 50. They all have to learn leadership. They all have to learn some skills of management somewhere, somehow. So if that is the case, we equally need to invest in having young people as leaders. So that would be my very long answer to your short question. I'm looking forward to the conversation on Latin America when I visit Honduras, Peru, and Brazil next month.
I really appreciate your point about having young people on boards. I'm worried, though, that the young people that may be appointed to those positions may have similar ideas to the older generations who already sit on that board in an effort to reaffirm their beliefs. May choose young people for leadership positions which have similar views to their own and may not bring as many new ideas to the table that perhaps better represent the younger population. So I'm just curious, how can you open that up so that it's not, as you were saying, it's not just a symbolic place, that young people are holding on these boards, but that it's really a true victory that they are open to sharing their ideas and don't feel like they have to fit into this box that other people put them in order to reach those positions.
It has to be a mixed grill. We need to continue to have, to encourage young people to go into competitive access to leadership, so that if my organization every 4 years people run for the board. So for that 25%, young women have to run for that position like everybody else, because you also want young people to grow the skills of being competitive, of presenting themselves, of being elected by the electorate, of being scrutinized, of going through the mill like everybody else. Because when you go through that process, it also takes away the tokenism, because they sit on the table in equal measure with anybody else who has been elected, because they've gone through an electoral process. So the second is that the reform of the structure of the institution, the policies, the procedures is not sufficient unless the culture of organizations change. So the culture of organizations have to change to ensure that there is a deeper listening to the other, listening to perspectives you don't agree with, expressing your analysis on why you disagree, but still agreeing to the common position. Because in most organizations, those who don't agree at times keep quiet instead of expressing their perspective. And at the same time, to continue to respect that my position is not the only position which is the correct position. Because we also want young women to be listening to the older women, and we want older women to be listening to the younger women. In many organizations, what I've seen is that there's not sufficient culture of really listening to the other. Maybe for that old mama, maybe this is her only space. Maybe she lives alone. She has no other relationships. She has no other social contacts, social networks. This is all that she has. So if this is taken away from her, life would lose meaning. So if as a young woman you say, but why exactly, is there any other way that you can continue to serve as a leader? Maybe you create a council of elders, or an advisory, something, or honorary members, and still have ways in which they can come to the organization without necessarily sticking on the position. But if you don't have the conversation, we may make judgments and assumptions, which can then hurt the other, but which can also go against our values. So the opportunity for crucial conversation and dialogue across generations is very important. Last is that the issues of power needs to be discussed openly. I feel that in many organizations there's not sufficient discussion about power. There's discussion about the roles, but no discussion about power, how to manage power, how to manage leadership, how as a leader you need to share your leadership with your staff, with your board, with your members, with other core board members, and how to do it in a way that you still feel you're accountable to your own responsibilities. I always talk about what I refer to as the Mandela effect. I'm yet to write it out, but Nelson Mandela is a very interesting example of somebody who stayed in prison for 27 years, got out of prison, decided to run for one term as a president, was just on this seat for 4 or so years, and yet everybody who goes to South Africa, every leader wants to meet with Nelson Mandela, even if they have to meet with the sitting head of state, Jacob Zuma. But it's not sufficient unless you've met Madiba. But for Nelson, he's just now a citizen like any other citizen. But he has created an image of a leader where leadership is not positional, but it's influence, and still remained influential even if he is not in a position. So how do we create leadership approaches where our elders in our organizations can remain influential, recognized, respected, without necessarily remaining on the position? It takes a change in organizational culture and approaches for that to happen.
Wait, let me just ask you one thing and then we'll return back to the floor. How do you feel, Nyaradzayi, about those child-focused international NGOs like Save the Children and Plan International, who and I, for instance, work fairly frequently with them, that do focus a lot of their programmatic attention on young adults, that do have large child and young adult participation programs, that do encourage young adults to engage in, let's say in Guatemala, in community councils, in development councils, children's parliaments, and so on. In other words, they do actually invest in not just leadership for personal decision making, and not just in affirmative action, but also in young persons' leadership in public decision making. How do you comment on their performance in regard of your concept of intergenerational leadership?
I think there is the charity model needs to continue to be explored further, because this is also about organizations led by adults who still see the young people as beneficiaries.
Although both those are rights-based organizations.
They are rights-based organizations, but within that rights-based, they are building the capacity of the young people to lead elsewhere, but not necessarily within the organization. This is where I was talking about how do we apply the governance models that we want out there to be in our own organizations. Because I would not hesitate or a moment to put in place for child-focused organizations like Plan or Save, to say we would put a system in our place of either board mentorship for young people who have been part of their programs, to actually be in some of their local boards, their advisory committees, or also to have young people, a conscious decision to have young people on their boards, not for it to just happen, but to have it as a planned outcome. So that they go beyond having 1 or 2 young people to be invited to a meeting to talk to the board. I sit on one of the boards, say, okay, can we get one of the brightest ones to talk to us? That's still not sufficient. I would really want to have a critical number sitting in the space. We can expand the space, because it's also where do we choose to put resources? You know, organizations will say it's very costly to have a big board, so let's have a board of 7 of us. But it's 7 old men and old women, a little bit older, and me, of course, making decision for 5 billion or 4 billion. I think we need to, I'm saying we, because I'm part of that change that I'm also advocating for, to take pragmatic measures which have a strategic long term. Because if Plan International have 3 young people on their board now, and have for their other committees, it means they have champions of Plan International for the next 30, 40 years. So it's not just an investment in the now. For example, Phumzile Mulambo Ngcuka, the former vice president of South Africa, was on the board of the World YWCA when she was 21 years old. And she would come to Geneva. It was the first time to come to Geneva and all that. She always refers to how those 4 years on the board gave her the courage and the confidence to enter into public politics and then to leave her country and be part of the struggle of liberation in South Africa. But she refers to how those discussions about her country in closed sessions of the board, which is the point I didn't put there, that the non-inclusion of young people in boards, in leadership, is also excluding the young people, a critical mass of citizenry, into closed-door discussion issues which are highly important and which at times are not in the public discourse. And I think just being in the peace negotiations, I was in the peace negotiations for Somalia, for Sudan, and I felt that we were people who were negotiating peace, which is a leadership space, were deciding for a whole generation now and in future, which was around very sensitive issues like oil, like borders, like demobilization, without the population that is affected being in the conversation. And I continued to feel, I still continue to feel that that space of closed discussions may need to be closed, but needs to allow other actors to come in, because currently that is very exclusionary.
Yeah. Actually, I would say our research shows that indeed that while these 2 organizations are rights-based in many ways, try to be, when it comes to their own accountability to young people and to people in general, they actually have a little bit of a blind spot. So I would agree with you. Yeah. On to the next question, and I see you, Joanna.
Yes, I was wondering about you talked about the perceptions of old people who think the young people might not be experienced enough and they want to just get the position and not earn it, and then young people viewing older co-workers as, oh, they're so old, they shouldn't be here anymore. But what are the actual steps which you might recommend to take, maybe you are going to talk about it later, to actually reframe this and to change these perceptions? Because I think that's a global trend that today our generation has so many opportunities, and we have so much more opportunities that our parents' generation had. They would have never dreamt about traveling and studying at other universities, for example. Sometimes they didn't speak foreign languages. They with 21 years they would maybe help their parents. They would get a job, but they would not have their master's degree. So I do think that there are many young, skillful, and very hardworking people, but a lot of times they really don't have they don't honor the experience of the older people. So there is no cooperation. Even though at a university, for example, they would admire one of their professors and they would have this relationship, but once they get into workplace, it just disappears. So what are the actual steps which are going to help to change these perceptions?
I think it ties with the earlier question around perception. It's also around perceptions. I think the first is, as you are saying, to continue to advocate that for young people, this is not also just being given, but that they are earning the recognition. It's not just offering on a silver platter to say we are looking for a young person, come, but actually that this is earned recognition, because it's not, the person who would be identified for that role is also somebody who is identified, either they've offered themselves, they've made an effort, they've put an application, they have put a CV, which also shows that there is some experience. So it means the person has actually also put in. So I think the notion of being given, it's a generational issue, because what I see every day is that young people, adults are having their conversations here. Young people are having their conversations here. There is no quality systematic space for intergenerational conversations on critical issues. So you would hear, including in my organization, oh, you know what, Nyaradzayi, we are really committed to the 25%, but we can't find the young people. You can't find the young people? In your whole city of 2 million, 6 million people, you can't find them. They are very hard to find. Where have you looked for them? Oh, they don't come to the YWCA. No, they are not here, so don't look for them here. Go to where they are and look for them where they are. Where actually are they? You know? So, and then the young women, oh my goodness, Nyaradzayi, don't even talk about it. Those flower arrangement programs and the cake sales, and they make me tired. You know, so the older women, when they are doing their baking and their flower arrangement, they are actually not just doing the baking and the flower arrangement. They are talking politics. They are caucusing on issues. They are giving each other advice. They are whispering tidbits on how to live a life, how to run the next election, who is their choice in the community. So I used to equally have an attitude around those old mama's activities until I went there. And then I realized why my mother never missed a Friday sewing club, because she never finished whatever she was sewing, but she would go every Friday for her sewing club. And I used to wonder, why is this woman so committed to a sewing club, but she never finishes a garment? Because they are not even sewing. Well, I'm revealing the women's secrets. But I think that's a generational issue. For us, we are blogging, we are online, we are chatting, we are communicating. I've been here 10 days. I talk to my daughter more on her chat space than on the phone. She rarely picks the phone, even if we still consider it a modern technology. But, Mom, can I Skype? I see you're online. Hey, I have a career conversation at 2 o'clock, but Mom, it's just a minute. You know, she's intruding directly into your space. So the spaces of engagement across generations are shifting. And we need, as NGOs, to cross the divide, both to respect that people communicate in different spaces, but also to share some of the tools across generations and to respect that. I think that is one. The other which you raise is what are the skills that we also need ourselves? I think the self-knowledge and the self-confidence is very important. Not everybody would want to be in public leadership, but everybody is a leader. I always say everybody under the sun is a leader in terms of you making crucial decisions, is a decision maker. Each person is making crucial decisions about their own lives, advising other people about their own lives and colleagues and networks. So everybody is able to do it, but not everybody would like to personally offer. The last is about family. I think that is very important in terms of especially young women as a barrier to participation. When I discussed yesterday about my own career growth, but I see in intergenerational leadership that older women, even now I would say, you know what, Charles, I have this job, so I'm going June, this is my calendar for June, I'm going to Peru, and oh dear, so what are the arrangements we make about him, about the family? So it's now informing. But when you are a young woman, you are not informing, you are seeking permission. You know what, dear, I have this possibility, I don't know what you think. Even if you have actually, you really want to go and you have made a decision and everything, but it's like you're seeking permission. You know what, dear, I don't know what you think. June, says, I don't think it's okay. So young women, including in our cultures, they are not only negotiating with their spouse, with their partner, they are negotiating possibly with the mother-in-law. They are also negotiating with the community, because in some communities, a young married woman who has just come into the village, look who she married. She's already in the school board. She doesn't even consult us to understand how this community. So there is that expectation of working with the culture and being in the rhythm of the culture. And it's very important in any organization or in any space to also understand those barriers, but also some of those also being supportive networks that exist to say the moment you early enough negotiate, affirm yourself, and get the capital around you of your family. I think I left, I joined the UN as a young woman, and I was already on a board of number organization, and I was 25, 26 years old. But it meant just by taking that initial bold step and negotiating with Charles, with my husband, and with my family, the rest was easy, because then they were now part of my leadership. So I think for young women especially, it's important to invest in the negotiation of the personal and the private in order for you to be an effective leader, because you also don't want to be in leadership and go home and things are not okay. You want to be happy at home, you want to be happy in your social setting, and you want to be happy in your leadership. You want to come home and celebrate the great time that you have had, but that needs to be negotiated in the private space, because we know for especially many women, many young women, that it's rather difficult to negotiate the private and the public.
So we take two more questions, and then first you and then you, and then come back to your recommendations.
Yes.
Towards the end, before we.
So your leadership image is more flexible rather than a rigid authority style, and more like a leadership without authority, like a civil movement leader. Those two images, so more flexible and more influence is important, and more higher vision probably required for the female leader. Do you have any method or strategies to how the female leader can educate or lead the men or male subordinate, or how can male superior can educate the next female leader? Do you have any method or strategies about that?
Yes, thank you. I believe in influence more than authoritarian positional leadership. That's what I really believe in. I believe that if you grow your leadership to be based on influence, you are a perpetual leader. But if you grow your leadership based on position, you can easily go into oblivion when you move away from the position, because the position is shaping your leadership and not necessarily your values and your principles shaping your leadership. And I think that people who cling to positions are more vulnerable leaders than people who work with influence. Because if I work with influence, it does not necessarily that I'm not responsible. I still have to take my executive decision positions. I still need to assert my authority where I have to make decisions. But it's only that at times it can be misunderstood when you are embracing a wider perspective of consultation in a world where there's an expectation of leaders being very instructive and directional. And so if you are more accommodating, you can be seen to be ineffective and less powerful leader. But I really believe that in today's world, we need less of the militaristic leadership models and more of the collective consensus building, influencing, because that means that the values are shared beyond the structure and the institution, but it's grounded within community building as an asset. I have also had an opportunity to serve as a leader with male colleagues. I think the first is to appreciate that there are still very few women in leadership position. And so when a woman is in leadership, she's being measured both as a leader and as a woman in leadership. So there is a double performance measure. Is she a good leader, yes or no? Is she a good woman in leadership? But that does not usually happen with male colleagues. It's just, is this person a leader and is he a good leader? The aspect that I have seen in my work, especially with ministers, female ministers, is how at times we have very feminine approaches, but when you come into a structure that is very masculine and hierarchical and authoritative, the expectation is that the women will apply those models into their own leadership style. So if they are not immediately performing to the expectation of the organization, they can be manipulated within the position or not fully supported within the position, because then they are not seen to be a strong leaders. We need a strong leader. We need a strong Minister of Justice who can just make the decision on whether this case should go to the ICC or not. When possibly this woman leader wants to consult a little bit more, look at all the factors, take a little bit of more time. With male subordinates, the other issue which I think is important is culture. Culture plays a very important role around leadership roles and expectations. Domestic dynamics. We have organizations where people at times work very late. So if you're a leader and you're working with a male subordinate for a project to finish at 9 o'clock, and you have to go home to your husband, he has to go home to his wife. Who were you with in the office until this hour? I was with my colleague. The two of you? Yes. Still working on this project? Yes. That's the pressure which women in leadership face, is their sexual and reproductive health and rights and social status is so much associated with their performance. Women in leadership in many organizations, especially in public sector, and I've done this great work around women running for public office, you find that women are always scrutinized, including by their subordinates and co-workers, on, is she married? Did she divorce twice? Is she a single mom? But that becomes the attitude which is transmitted in the relationship. But that same measure is not applied to male colleagues. It's a different perspective. Nobody asked, does he have 3 wives? Did he abandon the other girl whom he met at high school? All those issues are never discussed. So for the female leader in any situation, the private social status issues are always part of her public identity. It's not separate. So I just needed to reflect on that. Your other question was around mentorship. What is important for every leader is that mentorship happens with leaders in a higher position with you, but also with leaders who are your co-workers and in subordinate position. It doesn't matter whether those are male or female leaders. What is important is for a leader to create quality space and approach for getting that feedback and that advice. And also to create a feedback loop that enables the person giving the advice or giving the feedback to know that they've been listened to know that their advice has been considered, even if it has not been taken on, because it's advice. But it's important for the leader, male or female, to be able to reflect on that as a quality of leadership, that a leader must listen and must be able to give feedback.
Maybe
okay.
I actually have to leave, but my colleague here, Christiane, has taken over, but I want to make sure that the other student has
Yes.
time to, and then that Nyaradzayi has time to present her recommendation. I'm sorry.
Yes. Okay. Thanks.
I just have a small question. You've spoken very convincingly, I think, on the benefits and kind of reasoning for doing intergenerational leadership. But as with every organizational change, there's going to be drawbacks as well. So what do you see as the major drawbacks that an organization should be aware of when they're trying to implement this kind of intergenerational leadership?
The first is that one is shifting organizational culture. And when you are shifting organizational culture, there are key stakeholders, key individuals who may be benefiting from the current culture. So one has to manage, plan, and take appropriate steps to make sure that you reduce the sense that they are losing anything. Because what you're doing is to shift the focus on positional leadership to shared leadership. So you want to explain that when you share leadership, you actually don't get less powerful, but you get more powerful. So for people who hold on to positions, you want them to feel and to experience that the more they share leadership, the more powerful they become. It's not that they become less powerful if they share leadership, but they actually become more powerful if they share leadership. And explain how. Because the question is always of ego, visibility, opportunities, and all that range. And so it's important for the organization to have the appropriate tools which responds to how. The second is that in applying as a risk in shifting organizational culture, it has to be at multiple levels, that it's not just a change in the board, but it needs to be accompanied by program-related activities, by skills-building related activities, by feedback loops, and other actions, so that it's not just a one approach-based intervention, because that can be a risk if you just take one approach and don't look at the implications for the other. So for instance, we are an organization that is so much supported by individuals, so much based on individual giving. And also people who give are also people who are a little bit older. So you don't want to risk your resource base by taking an approach which would not be seen to be enabling and supporting. Yeah. I think he had another question before he leaves, and then I'll come back to you, or?
Just example, I'm Japanese, and in Japan we have Sadako Ogata. She used to be a United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. She became the UNHCR after she was 60 years old, and her husband already retired. She was also a professor at the university. But when she became the High Commissioner, she had no knowledge about that, but she had authority, the top of the organization. However, her previous commissioner, the High Commissioner, they failed to manage organizations. Even if they had authority, they failed. So Sadako Ogata quickly generated her image or her vision about how we can work for the refugees. About 6 months or 1 month, 1 year. So that many people, including male subordinate, followed her. So that very now she's now 80 years or something. She's living in JICA.
Yeah.
It used to be a very corrupted organization in Japan, but she changed everything in Japan. So that so far, I think that what kind of vision for the more flexible leader, female leader, should have is more important. So I think
Thanks for the sharing, and my apologies. I was a young junior officer in the United Nations when Madam Sadako was with UNHCR. And for me, it was also important, the issue that you are raising on how do you change culture is also having role models within the system. So because we had an elder who is a role model, who is a woman, who is married, and I would say to Charles, you know, it's possible actually. And say, yeah, I have to speak to the old men. So I hope my husband would be able to meet Madam Sadako and share the experience. But thank you for that perspective and for bringing an example. Okay. I think your question was on what are the risks. So the risk is one of governance stability and a smooth transition. That's one risk that one has to manage. The other risk is that you don't want to invest in young people's leadership just as access to leadership without investing in their skills in leadership. So it means any shift to intergenerational leadership must accompany with programs for on-board mentorship, with exposure opportunities, with training opportunities, because you also don't want to set up the young people for potential failure. You don't want them to be in the position, be given a role to lead a committee, to chair a committee. They may never have chaired a committee. So you want to also have the resources around them to grow their leadership skills whilst on the board. So I think that is a risk if organizations just shift the culture, shift the structure, but don't resource the transition.
I think we would like to have this rare opportunity to hear you speak a little bit more about your recommendations. I can sense that a lot of it seeped through your talk, but we would love to hear. And then we will adjourn, but if there were people that still had a question, we may, we'll use your discretion to see if we have time for one more question or if this prompts.
Thank you. You come into a university setting like this, carrying a deep excitement on an issue, and you dig your mind into literature, into theory, and you are a practitioner. You are not coming as an academician. And you say, so what should be the recommendations which should straddle both worlds? I still have 3 days to go, so that is going to give me a little bit of extra time to pull together some of my recommendations, but a couple of recommendations that are emerging. One is in terms of academic research. I think I still feel that there is a gap around exploring much more deeply the model of intergenerational leadership. We need more analytical work around this. We need more to ground more the conceptual frameworks. Even if I was able to pull through the rights-based empowerment and social capital as frameworks, but I think it's important to expand and deepen that to be one coherent framework other than 3 fragmented frameworks. So that is my first recommendation, just looking at the academic space, and possibly institutions like this could offer an opportunity for that to happen, and to ground that in terms of the contribution both to the knowledge base and academic conversation on non-profits and governance and leadership, but also in a way that practically contributes to the practice and the experience of non-profit organizations. So that is my first recommendation. My second recommendation is that it's important, even if it's symbolic or ceremonial for non-profit organizations and NGOs to have clear affirmative action or special measures within their governance models that facilitate access, capacity strengthening, affirmation, and effective involvement, especially of young people in the leadership of the organization. And the notion of leadership should transcend just the positions within organizations, but should look at the various levels within which an organization provides leadership. I'm thinking also of the position of chief executives of non-profit organizations, that we need more young people to be in the leadership of non-profit organizations. I have seen it with my own organization, where in Ethiopia we had Melat. She was 25 years old, and she was the chief executive of the YWCA of Ethiopia. And she did amazing, amazing, amazing work for 5 years on that role. When she transitioned, the deputy position had to always be there was then a change that if the chief executive is an adult person, is a little bit older, there has to be a generation gap within the chief executive position of the organization. Great transformation. So that is more about special measures within organization. The third recommendation that I have is around mentorship for leadership. For leadership in non-profit organizations or in leadership for public office, that we need clear, solid mentorship programs that can provide not only the advice, but the immersion into an experience of the organization. And such a mentorship program could include board mentorship, the appointment that I talked about on having young people to be on a board in an associate status, but a mentorship, a leadership mentorship program, I think it's very important. The fourth recommendation that I have is to continue, especially with the various NGOs and transnational NGOs, on shifting organizational cultures, shift in those attitudes and perceptions, and have a robust advocacy, capacity building, awareness related programs and activities that can enable that shift to happen. And that has to be multiple activities at multiple level. And the last recommendation that I have is storytelling. I think we live in the development world where it's as if the issues we are talking about are out there. It's other people out there. It's not us. I feel we need a new narrative where people can talk about their experiences in an affirming way, of their own leadership, of their own experience in their own community, of their own barriers, their own challenges, their own perspectives. Because I've seen in development work that it's as if we are developing this for other people who are not necessarily each one of us on this table. So the more we are so confident and comfortable about our own narratives, the more we can apply them for a greater transformational agenda. And that is why I think in the career discussion yesterday, I gave a personal narrative. It was more to say, whatever narrative you carry, it's part of a transformative agenda. It's part of an intergenerational agenda. Because what you experience now, or last year, or 10 years ago, is always going to inform your own leadership 20 years from now. There is a direct continuum between who I am now and who I was and who I will be. And at times, we have a hesitancy of connecting the personal with the collective. And yet there is no collective without the personal. And I really feel that we need to tell our narratives more so that the world does not continue to be faceless. We have a world which at times you wonder who is written on this page. It can be anyone, anywhere, but we need to continue to bring closer, a closer face, a closer feeling to who are the people we are talking about. And in doing that, we celebrate diversity. I love working on issues of diversity, because that's the beauty of humanity. The beauty of creation is its diversity. And at times we don't celebrate that sufficiently. And to say the experiences of young people in my village might be the same, but it's slightly different from the experience of the young people I saw in Hebron, or the experience of young people that I danced with in Trinidad, or the young people that I've spent the last 2 weeks with here in Syracuse, from all kinds of cultures and background. So for me, an intergenerational perspective which celebrates diversity allows us to dig into the reality of humanity, and that's my recommendation.
Well, thank you so much, Nyaradzayi.